In the dark hours of August 21st, 1,942 900 Japanese soldiers were crossing a 15-yard strip of sand on Guadalcanal. They had crossed half of it. Their commander had done everything right. He had calculated the numbers. He had timed the attack. He had chosen the crossing point after studying the terrain. He was 50 years old, decorated, experienced, and operating according to a plan that his intelligence services had given him every reason to believe would work. What he didn't know was that several guns on the other side were loaded with rounds that each contained 122 steel balls. He didn't know the Americans had 10 times more men than his intelligence had told him. He didn't know the airfield he had been sent to capture was already flying combat aircraft. What he knew was that the sand was under his feet, the objective was ahead, and the attack was underway. That was the last thing most of his men would ever know. To understand what happened at the Ilu River on the night of August 21st, 1942, you have to go back 6 weeks. You have to go back to the first days of August, when the United States Marine Corps landed on a jungle island in the southern Pacific that almost no one in America had ever heard of, and began a campaign that would last 6 months and define the character of the entire Pacific War. The island was Guadalcanal. It was part of the Solomon Islands chain, a string of volcanic peaks rising from the Pacific southwest of New Britain. In the geography of the Pacific War in the summer of 1942, Guadalcanal occupied a position of enormous strategic importance for one specific reason. The Japanese were building an airfield on it. That airfield, when completed, would give Japanese land-based aircraft the ability to reach New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. It would extend the Japanese defensive perimeter in a direction that threatened Allied supply lines to Australia. It would make the already difficult task of fighting back across the Pacific substantially more difficult, and it would do so at a moment when the Allied position in the Pacific was still extremely fragile. To understand why that mattered so much in August of 1942, you need to understand where the war stood. 7 months had passed since Pearl Harbor. In those 7 months, Japan had seized the Philippines, Malaya, Burma, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and most of the island chains across the Central and Western Pacific. The speed and scope of that expansion had been stunning, had overturned every pre-war assumption about the limits of Japanese military power, and had placed Allied planners in the position of trying to hold a line somewhere, while simultaneously building the industrial and military capacity needed to go on offense. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May had been the first major check on Japanese expansion. It had stopped the Japanese move on Port Moresby in New Guinea. But it had come at a cost. The carrier Lexington lost, the Yorktown damaged, and it had not reversed the broader momentum. The Battle of Midway in June had done something different. 4 Japanese carriers had been sunk in a single afternoon, along with the experienced air groups that flew from them. The carriers could eventually be replaced. The pilots and aircrew could not be replaced on any reasonable timeline. Japan had been training carrier aviators for years, and the men who died at Midway represented a generation of expertise that the Japanese training system could not regenerate quickly. Midway had shifted the naval balance in a way that the Coral Sea had not. But Midway had not ended the war. Japanese forces remained in control of vast territories. The defensive perimeter they had established was deep and would be costly to penetrate. And the construction on Guadalcanal represented the forward edge of a new push, an attempt to extend that perimeter southward in ways that would complicate any Allied counteroffensive. The 1st Marine Division was given the task of stopping it. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, born March 13, 1887, had commanded the 1st Marine Division since March of that year. He was 55 years old. He had served in Haiti, Nicaragua, China, and a series of postings throughout a career that had given him the particular education that decades of service provide, not primarily an education in tactics or weapons or logistics, though it includes all of those, but an education in the specific gravity of command, in what it means to be responsible for the lives of men in situations you cannot fully control. What he had not been given was adequate preparation time. The landing on Guadalcanal, designated Operation Watchtower, and sometimes referred to by the men who planned and executed it as Operation Shoestring, was accelerated beyond what Vandegrift considered safe. His division was not fully equipped. Some units had not completed their training. The supply situation was precarious. Ships had not fully unloaded their cargo when operational considerations required them to leave. When Vandegrift was informed that the landings would proceed on August 7th, he had approximately 3 weeks to prepare what he could and accept what he could not fix. The landings on August 7th achieved tactical surprise. The Marines came ashore on Guadalcanal and on nearby Tulagi and the smaller islands around it. The Japanese responded initially with air power rather than effective ground resistance. The airfield, which the Americans would rename Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway, was captured on August 8th with its runway nearly complete. Then things became complicated. On the night of August 8th and into the early hours of August 9th, Japanese surface ships struck the Allied naval force protecting the Marine beachhead and inflicted one of the worst naval defeats in American history. 4 Allied cruisers were sunk in what became known as the Battle of Savo Island. The Japanese commander, Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, had brought a force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer through the darkness at high speed, caught the Allied screening force unprepared, and departed before the larger American forces could respond. He left behind the burning hulks of the Astoria, Quincy, Vincent, and the Australian cruiser Canberra. The naval covering force withdrew after Savo Island. The supply ships, which had not finished unloading, left with them. The Marines on Guadalcanal found themselves holding an airfield with incomplete supplies, no naval support, and considerable uncertainty about when either condition would change. They were told to hold. In the weeks that followed, holding was exactly what they did. The Marines completed the airfield using Japanese construction equipment left behind when the Japanese labor troops retreated. They improved their defensive perimeter. They established supply procedures and medical facilities and the 100 other organizational necessities of a force preparing to fight in place. They patrolled the jungle and mapped the terrain and built the institutional knowledge of the ground that distinguishes a force that has been somewhere for weeks from a force that arrived yesterday. Henderson Field became operational on August 20th, when the first American aircraft landed on its runway. A squadron of Marine fighters and a squadron of Marine dive bombers arrived from the escort carrier Long Island. This force, assembled from whatever aircraft and pilots could be made available from the limited resources of the Pacific Theater, immediately began flying combat operations. The Cactus Air Force, named for Guadalcanal's radio code word, was born. The pilots who flew from Henderson Field in those early weeks were operating under conditions that would have been considered inadequate by any normal standard. The aircraft were a mix of models in varying states of maintenance. Spare parts were scarce. Fuel was a constant concern. The men who flew lived in conditions that ranged from primitive to dangerous, sleeping in whatever shelter was available near the runway, eating whatever the supply situation permitted, flying multiple missions on days when the tactical situation required it. They flew anyway. Every day that Henderson Field was operational was a day that Japanese forces attempting to move by sea toward Guadalcanal faced the prospect of air attack. The Cactus Air Force could not stop everything, but it changed the calculus of movement in the waters around the island in ways that would prove strategically significant as the campaign developed. On August 20th, The same day the first Cactus Air Force aircraft arrived, Japanese aircraft conducted raids against Henderson Field. The raids destroyed several PBY Catalina flying boats moored in the water near the field and hit some fuel storage. They did not destroy the runway. They did not destroy the combat aircraft. When the raids were over, Henderson Field was still operational. That evening, somewhere in the jungle east of the marine perimeter, Colonel Kiyoano Ichiki was preparing his men for the assault. Ichiki was born on January 26, 1892. He had spent his adult life in the Japanese Imperial Army. His career had taken him through the institutional development of an officer class that was, in its finest representatives, genuinely formidable, educated, disciplined, serious about their profession in ways that the professional armies of any nation are serious when they have been at war for years. He had been present at the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937. He had fought in the campaigns in northern China. He had been recognized and decorated for his service. Within the Japanese Army's institutional culture, he was considered one of the finest battalion-level commanders available. When planning staff identified the Guadalcanal airfield as a target requiring rapid seizure by a small, fast, aggressive force, Ichiki's name surfaced as the commander who could do it. He had the experience. He had the reputation. He had the aggressive orientation that the mission required. He had been given intelligence estimates telling him there were approximately 2,000 American troops holding the airfield. That intelligence was wrong by a factor of 5. The 1st Marine Division was not an isolated garrison. It was a full division, approximately 19,000 men at its authorized strength, though the units on Guadalcanal in August numbered somewhat fewer. It had artillery, anti-aircraft weapons, organized supply, and 2 weeks of defensive construction behind it. The men who held the perimeter around Henderson Field had spent those 2 weeks learning the terrain they were defending in the way that soldiers learn terrain when they know they will have to fight on it, measuring distances, identifying covered approaches, establishing communications, registering weapons on specific points so that fire could be directed accurately even in darkness. The intelligence failure that had told Ichiki there were 2,000 Americans was not the result of carelessness. It reflected the genuine difficulty of reconnaissance in jungle terrain, the speed with which American reinforcement had outpaced Japanese information gathering, and the particular institutional problem that affects any organization whose estimates have been accurate long enough to establish a default trust in them. The estimate of 2,000 had been reasonable at an earlier moment in the campaign. By the time Ichiki received it and acted on it, it was catastrophically outdated. Ichiki gave his order to attack because the numbers he had been given told him the attack would succeed. He was not wrong about the tactical situation as he understood it. He was wrong about the tactical situation as it actually was, and the gap between those two versions of reality would be measured that night in the lives of his men. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, occupied the positions on the western bank of the Ilu River. His men had built what they could build, registered their weapons on the ground they expected to defend, and settled into the specific routine of soldiers waiting in defensive positions for an attack they know is coming without knowing exactly when. Among the weapons in his defensive line were several M3 37mm anti-tank guns. The men who crewed those guns had no reason to believe that night would be any different from the nights that had preceded it. They loaded their weapons and waited. That is what soldiers do. They wait, and then things happen, and then they respond to what has happened, and then they wait again. To understand what happened at the Ilu River, you need to understand the ground. Guadalcanal is a large island, roughly 90 miles long and 30 miles wide, covered with jungle so dense that movement away from established tracks is measured in yards per hour. The mountains rise steeply from the northern coastal plain. covered with vegetation that had not been substantially disturbed before the war, and that presented soldiers trying to move through it with one of the most physically demanding environments in the Pacific theater. Heat, humidity, so absolute that clothing never dried between soakings, in varieties and quantities that the men who survived the campaign would describe decades later with a residual revulsion that time had not softened. Mud that could swallow a boot, and then the leg attached to the boot, and then require significant effort from several men to retrieve both. Rivers that ran clear over their beds one day and ran brown and fast after rain the next, and that could not be trusted to be the same obstacle 2 days running. And at night, a darkness so complete that a man could not see his hand at the end of his arm without some source of light, and sound carried in ways that day sounds did not. And what a man heard in the darkness of the Guadalcanal jungle was not necessarily interpretable as any specific thing. The northern coastal plain where Henderson Field sat was a narrow strip of relatively flat land between the mountains and the beach. It was crossed by several rivers flowing from the high ground to the sea. The Ilu River was the most significant of these crossings in the sector east of the airfield. Follow the Ilu from the mountains to the sea, and you reach the coast at a point approximately 2 miles east of Henderson Field. There, where the river's flow met the beach, the freshwater current deposited sediment that had over years accumulated into a sandspit, a narrow tongue of compacted sand extending from the eastern bank of the river across the channel to the western bank. That sandspit was between 15 and 20 yards wide at the point where it could be crossed on foot, in any direction but straight across those 15 yards. A man wanting to cross the Ilu River at night would be entering water of uncertain depth and uncertain current. The sandspit was the crossing. It was the only practical crossing for a formed body of men moving at night with weapons and ammunition. Military planners on both sides of the river recognized it as such. Vandegrift's staff had identified the sandspit as the critical point when they first surveyed the defensive problem. Any Japanese force moving along the coast from the east toward Henderson Field would encounter the Ilu River. Any Japanese force wanting to cross that river in the dark, in strength, without swimming, would concentrate at the sandspit. Concentration is the opposite of what a defending force wants to present to defensive weapons. It is exactly what a weapon designed to distribute force across an area wants to face. Several 37mm M3 anti-tank guns were positioned to cover the sandspit from the western bank. Machine gun positions reinforced them. The fields of fire were registered in daylight so that the weapons could be aimed and fired in darkness. The defensive line had been prepared with the understanding that if an attack came from the east, it would come through this point, and this point would bear the weight of whatever defensive response was required. The M3 37mm was a light, wheeled weapon designed for mobility. Its barrel measured nearly 7 feet long. It weighed approximately 900 pounds in firing position. A trained crew could sustain a rate of fire of roughly 25 rounds per minute under operational conditions in darkness, under stress, with the specific noise and physical demands of a firefight surrounding them. Its standard anti-armor rounds were designed to penetrate tank plate at several hundred yards, dense pointed, optimized for a single penetrating path through a single target. It also carried the M2 canister round. The M2 canister was the descendant of a technology as old as artillery itself. For as long as armies have fired cannon, they have recognized that there are situations where the threat is not a wall or a fortification or an armored vehicle, but men, and that a round distributing force across an area is more effective against men in the open than a round designed to penetrate a single point. Grape shot, canister, case shot. The names changed across centuries, but the principle was unchanged. The M2 held 122 steel balls, each approximately 1/3 of an inch in diameter, packed inside a thin metal shell. When the round fired, the propellant sent the whole assembly down the barrel at approximately 2,600 feet per second. As it left the muzzle, the thin metal shell stripped away and the balls spread outward in an expanding cone. At 50 yards, the cone was perhaps 4 or 5 feet wide, each ball still carrying lethal energy, the pattern tight enough that adjacent men could be struck by the same round. At 100 yards, the pattern broadened further, 10 feet, 12, beginning to cover the width of a narrow column. At 200 yards, the cone expanded across a significant portion of the width of the Ilu sandspit in a single shot. Multiple guns, multiple rounds, into a column that could not spread left or right because the river was on either side, into a compression point that the geography had created and that the defense had covered. The Marines waiting on the western bank had not invented anything new. They had positioned what they had where the terrain told them to put it, and they had loaded the rounds that gave those weapons their best performance against the most likely target. What they had not known, what no one could predict with certainty, was exactly how many men would come, and at exactly what moment, and whether their ammunition and their nerve would hold through everything the night was about to ask of them. The night was quiet in the way that Guadalcanal nights were not truly quiet insects. The sound of the river, the distant sea, but quiet in the specific sense of no human movement that could be identified across the water. The Marines in their positions waited. Some dozed in the particular light sleep of men who know they cannot afford to be fully unconscious, but cannot afford not to rest. Others watched the darkness across the river with the specific attention of men who have been told something is coming and who are waiting for the moment when the darkness begins to produce shapes. That moment came at approximately 130 on August 21st. The forward elements moved onto the sandspit. From the eastern jungle, the sandspit appeared as an opening, a gap in the darkness where the night sky reflected faintly off the water and sand, slightly lighter than the surrounding terrain. The path forward, the crossing. They moved onto it. The Marine machine guns opened first. The 0.3 caliber Browning heavy machine guns were water-cooled weapons capable of sustained fire without overheating. Tracers cut across the water in low arcs and found the sandspit and the men on it. Ichi's men continued to advance. This is what Japanese soldiers had been trained to do: continue the attack regardless of fire, accept casualties and press forward. The doctrine held that a determined assault delivered with sufficient violence and speed would reach the objective before the defenders could organize an effective response. The machine gun fire was expected. The expectation was that it could be absorbed and crossed. What followed was not expected. The 37mm guns fired canister. Each round left the barrel. The thin metal shell stripped away at the muzzle. The 122 steel balls spread outward at 2,600 feet per second and crossed the distance to the sandspit in a fraction of a second. At a range of 150 to 200 yards, the pattern covered a substantial portion of the sandspit's width. The first round hit the forward element of the column. The second followed. The third, each in rapid succession from multiple guns, each distributing its payload across the same compressed space. The forward element disappeared. That is the word survivors used in the accounts compiled through post-war examination. Not fell, not retreated. Disappeared as a formation in the moment of the first canister volley. The next wave moved forward. The doctrine held, continue the attack. The men behind knew what they had seen happen to those ahead of them. They moved onto the sandspit anyway. The guns fired. The second wave encountered the same result. Ichiki continued the attack because his training and his orders left him no other option within the framework of what he understood. The alternatives were retreat, which his doctrine did not accommodate as a response to initial resistance, or success, which required crossing the sand. He chose to continue because continuing was what the situation required of him. Wave after wave. The geometry of the sandspit did not change. The guns covered it from the same range with the same rounds. The outcome of each wave was determined before the men in it began to cross, by the arithmetic of the terrain and the weapons positioned to exploit it. One note that must be attached to this account: the figure of 1,000 steel balls referenced in this story's title is an aggregate derived from multiple guns, firing multiple rounds across the hours of the engagement. It is not a count drawn from a single primary source documenting exactly how many rounds of canister were fired. The actual number requires verification against 1st Marine Division records. What the figure captures is the cumulative physical effect of several weapons firing multiple rounds of canister at short range into a compressed column of men over a sustained period. The aggregate was devastating. The specific number is an estimate derived from the known characteristics of the weapon and the known duration of the engagement. At some point during the engagement, the canister ammunition for the 37mm guns was expended. The sources do not agree precisely on when this occurred. What they show is that the gun crews transitioned to armor-piercing rounds and continued firing. Armor-piercing rounds against infantry are a fundamentally different instrument from canister, a single penetrating wound per round, rather than a distributed pattern of wounds. The guns were still dangerous. The rounds were still lethal. But the transition marked a change in the character of the defensive fire at the moment when the attack was still ongoing. This was the most dangerous period of the night for the Marine defense. Some elements of Ichiki's force crossed the sandspit. Hand-to-hand fighting occurred on the western bank. Marines in forward positions engaged men who had made it across the sand. The Marine line was under direct pressure from soldiers who had survived the crossing and were among the defensive positions. The fighting was close, confused, and conducted in darkness by men whose training and individual resolve were all that governed what happened at each specific point of contact. The line held. It held the way lines sometimes hold not through any single moment of decision, but through the accumulated resistance of men who were not willing to yield the ground they had been given to hold. The main body of the Japanese attack did not cross. The sandspit had done what the terrain said it would do, and the weapons positioned to cover it had done what the weapons said they could do, and the attack spent itself against that combination. Dawn began to come over Guadalcanal. The firing along the river diminished as the attack exhausted its forward momentum. The Marines in their positions waited in the growing light to see what the night had produced. The sun rose on August 21st, 1942, and the light showed the sandspit as it was. The Japanese dead lay where they had fallen, on the sand, in the shallow water at the river's edge, on the western bank, where some had come through before being stopped. The accounting that followed the engagement placed the total Japanese dead at approximately 800 across the full course of the battle. The Marines had lost 34 killed and 75 wounded. Colonel Kiyoano Ichiki was not among the dead on the sandspit. He had survived the night. This is the specific fact about the Battle of the Tenaru that changes the simple telling. The forward assault had been broken. The main body of the attack had been stopped at the crossing by weapons, positioned to cover exactly that ground. But Ichiki had not been in the forward element. He had survived the night with some remnant of his force, and he had reorganized those survivors in the coconut grove along the eastern bank. He held what ground he could hold, because retreat was not a category. His training and his orders had given him the tools to execute. Whatever understanding he now had of the situation, however many of his men he could see were dead, however clearly the tactical position had become untenable, the framework within which he operated had not prepared him for the decision to withdraw. Major General Vandegrift assessed the situation from the western bank and made his decision without extended deliberation. He ordered Colonel Clifton B. Cates to execute a flanking movement with the 1st Marines Regiment. Cates was 48 years old, born August 31st, 1893. He had served in France in the First World War, had fought at Belleau Wood, and across the battlefields of that earlier war, and had spent the decades between the wars doing what career officers do, building the skills and institutional knowledge that peacetime service provides, waiting for the next occasion when those skills would be needed. He would later serve as Commandant of the Marine Corps. On this August morning, he was a regimental commander with an order and a direction to move. His regiment crossed the Ilu upstream at a fordable point, moved along the eastern bank, and closed on the Coconut Grove from the south and east. M2A4 light tanks from the 1st Marine Tank Battalion moved with the flanking force. They were not heavy armor by any measure light tanks, built for mobility rather than protection, but against infantry in a coconut grove without anti-tank weapons. They were sufficient. They crossed the river and moved north along the beach toward the grove. The encirclement completed itself. What followed in the Coconut Grove was not a battle, in the sense that the night's fighting at the sandspit had been a battle. The sandspit fight had possessed a specific tactical logic and attacking force, with a defined objective, a defending force covering the approach, weapons, and terrain, combining to determine the outcome. The Coconut Grove fighting had a different geometry. The Japanese survivors were surrounded. The river was behind them. The sea was to one side. The closing Marine units were ahead and to the other side. There was no avenue of movement that did not require crossing one of those barriers under fire. There was no tactical objective that remained achievable. There was no support coming. They fought because the situation left no other option within the framework of what they had been trained to do. The tanks moved through the grove. The infantry moved with them, clearing what the tanks disturbed. The coconut trees provided some cover, but not the kind that stops vehicles or the infantry following them. The fighting was close and destructive and moved in one direction. Kiyoano Ichiki burned his regimental colors. The act was specific in its meaning. The regimental colors of a Japanese army unit represented the unit's identity, its connection to the emperor, the accumulated honor of every action the unit had fought, and every man who had served under those colors. To allow them to fall into enemy hands was a dishonor that the Japanese military code treated with the same gravity it attached to surrender itself. By burning them, Ichiki was doing the one thing left available to him that the code gave him the authority to do on behalf of his unit. He committed suicide on the morning of August 21st, 1942, in the Coconut Grove east of the Ilu River, after the force he had led to Guadalcanal had been destroyed. Of the 916 men who had landed 3 days earlier, approximately 15 were taken prisoner. The remainder were dead. The small number of prisoners reflects something important about the nature of the Pacific War that the European theater does not fully illuminate. The Japanese military code treated capture as a form of dishonor equivalent to surrender. The men of Ichiki's detachment, like Japanese soldiers throughout the Pacific campaign, did not surrender in numbers that could be considered conventional by the standards of Western military practice. The 15 men taken prisoner at the Ilu had been wounded to the point where resistance was impossible, or were in states of consciousness that prevented them from acting on their training. Those 15 men and the documents and equipment recovered in the grove and on the sandspit provided American intelligence with information about Japanese intentions that proved useful in the weeks ahead. The intelligence worked in one direction and not the other. Japanese intelligence had told Ichiki there were 2,000 Americans on Guadalcanal. American intelligence, drawing on everything the battle had yielded, was building a more accurate picture of what Japanese forces intended to do next. The asymmetry had existed before the battle. The battle made it visible. That same morning, August 21st, 1942, the aircraft of the Cactus Air Force flew combat operations against Japanese naval forces in the waters around Guadalcanal. The pilots who flew those missions took off from Henderson Field. They flew the aircraft that had arrived the previous day. They climbed out over the water found their targets, attacked, returned, refueled, and took off again. The field that had been the objective of the night's attack was operational. It was flying aircraft. It was conducting the kind of operations that would, over the following months, change the strategic mathematics of the campaign for Guadalcanal. The significance of Henderson Field was not lost on either side. The Japanese understood that land-based air power operating from the island changed what they could do in the waters around it. Every supply run to their own forces on Guadalcanal, every attempt to reinforce those forces by sea would have to account for aircraft flying from the field. The Tokyo Express, the destroyer runs that tried to resupply Japanese forces on the island under cover of darkness, was a response to the threat that Henderson Field posed to daylight movement. It was expensive, it was dangerous, and it was never entirely adequate. The Marines understood that Henderson Field was the reason they were there, and the reason they would be attacked again. Every Japanese effort on Guadalcanal in the months that followed was oriented in some way toward the airfield, toward neutralizing it by air bombardment, by naval gunfire, by infantry assault from positions in the interior, by any means available. And every American defensive effort was oriented in some way toward keeping it operational. The campaign that followed the Battle of the Tenaru was long and costly for both sides. Naval battles fought in the waters around the island resulted in losses that reduced the capacity of both fleets. Aircraft from both sides were destroyed in numbers that strained the replacement and training capacity of both air forces. The men on the island, Marine and Army on one side, Japanese Army on the other, fought in conditions that became progressively worse as supply lines struggled, and the island's climate and disease burden took their toll alongside combat casualties. The Japanese launched two more major attempts to retake Henderson Field by infantry assault in the months that followed. The Battle of the Bloody Ridge in September 1942 saw Japanese forces under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi attempt to attack Henderson Field from the south through jungle terrain. The attack failed after brutal fighting on the ridgeline south of the airfield, stopped by Marine defensive forces that had prepared positions and held them. The October attacks by Japanese forces under Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake were larger and better coordinated and also failed, at enormous cost to the attacking forces. In each of these engagements, the pattern that had appeared at the Ilu River repeated itself in various forms. Japanese forces attacking with numerical estimates and tactical assumptions that did not correspond to the actual defensive situation encountered prepared defenses in terrain that favored the defender. The attacks were pressed with genuine determination and at great cost. The defenses held. By February of 1943, 6 months after the initial Marine landing, Japanese forces were evacuated from Guadalcanal under cover of darkness, completing one of the most difficult military operations of the Pacific War, a successful withdrawal under pressure. The island was in American hands. Henderson Field was secure. The campaign that had begun with the landing on August 7th, 1942, had reached its conclusion. The strategic significance of Guadalcanal was debated by analysts and historians in the decades that followed. Some argued that the island itself was not as important as the battle over it suggested. Others contended that the campaign established the pattern and the momentum for the island-hopping strategy that would carry American forces across the Pacific over the following 3 years. What is not debated is that the Japanese offensive capacity that had swept across the Pacific in the 8 months after Pearl Harbor was broken on Guadalcanal, and that the campaign established a template, however bloody, however costly, for how the Pacific War would be won. The battle at the Ilu River was the first test of that template. The sun was fully up over Guadalcanal on the morning of August 21st, and the aircraft at Henderson Field were flying. Pollock's men on the western bank of the Ilu were attending to their dead and their wounded and the particular aftermath of a night fight the accounting, the resupply, the processing of what had happened in the hours of darkness. The sandspit in the growing light was not what it had been 12 hours earlier. 12 hours earlier, it had been a piece of ground. Now it was a piece of ground that carried the specific weight that battlefields carry after they have been used for the purpose for which they were named. Cates's regiment was completing its work in the coconut grove. The prisoners were being collected and processed. The weapons and documents recovered from the Japanese positions were being cataloged for the intelligence value they might yield. The dead were being counted. The numbers, when they were established, would tell the story in the way that numbers tell stories accurately, in a specific sense, and incompletely in the ways that numbers are always incomplete when what they are counting is human. 916 men had landed on Guadalcanal 3 days earlier. Approximately 15 were taken prisoner. Approximately 800 were dead. The remainder were unaccounted for, lost in the jungle, dead in positions that had not yet been located. 34 Marines were dead. 75 were wounded. Colonel Ichiki was dead in the coconut grove. Major General Vandegrift was preparing his assessment of the engagement for the command chain above him. His report would describe what had happened in the operational language that military reports use: units, positions, weapons, casualties, outcomes. It would not describe what it had been like to wait in the darkness while the firing built and then peaked and then diminished, or what it had been like to hear that the line had held in certain places by the individual efforts of men who would not be specifically named in the official account. The Cactus Air Force pilots were in the air. The intelligence failure that had sent Ichiki's detachment onto the sandspit predated the battle by weeks. It was embedded in the reconnaissance reports, in the estimates, in the institutional confidence of a system that had been providing reasonably accurate information in earlier phases of the war, and that had not caught up to the speed of American reinforcement on Guadalcanal. By the time Ichiki gave his order to attack, the failure was complete. The battle was its consequence. The guns at the Ilu River stopped the Banzai charge. The wrong numbers started it. What had been demonstrated in the dark hours of August 21st on a 15-yard strip of compacted sand at the mouth of a river on an island that most Americans had not heard of 3 months earlier was not a truth about Japanese soldiers or American soldiers as categories of human beings. It was a truth about the relationship between information and outcome. Ichiki's men were brave. Their training was serious. Their commitment was genuine. They faced what came at them on the sandspit with the full application of everything they had been prepared to give. And what they had been prepared to give was considerable. None of it was sufficient, because what came at them on the sandspit was not what the information told them to expect. The canister rounds, the 122 steel balls in each round, the aggregate of rounds from multiple guns through the hours of the night, were the instrument of what happened at the Ilu River. They were physics, applied through weapons, directed by men who had positioned those weapons where the terrain told them they should go. But the thing that put 900 soldiers in front of those rounds, at that range, in that compressed space, with no direction to go but forward into them, was not the guns and not the Marines behind them. It was the number 2,000. 2,000 Americans, the intelligence said, on an island held by 10,000. The information was wrong. The men who acted on it paid the price that wrong information charges in war, which is the most absolute price available. And on the runway at Henderson Field, on the morning of August 21st, 1942, the aircraft of the Cactus Air Force were warming their engines and preparing to fly. The airfield that 900 men had marched toward in darkness, guided by numbers that did not correspond to anything on the ground, was operational. It was flying. It was not taken. It would not be taken. The steel was physics. Everything that put the men in front of the steel was something else entirely.